Good morning and welcome to Onward in Love and Caregiving. I'm Greg Johnson. I'm the president and CEO of GJP International, which is Greg Johnson Partnerships International. And here in New York, I have the great privilege of serving as the chief advisor to the CEO of Emblem Health for family caregiving. And I want to welcome you to this New Year series that we're doing. We're taking a moment to take a deep breath wherever we may be in the healthcare spectrum of family caregiving. I find that to be very helpful, and I want to thank you for the many notes that I've received, emails and so forth, from people saying, thank you for just pausing and letting us go back and look at what is family caregiving. And that's what we've been doing. Best definition I know. What is a family caregiver? It's someone who shows up, and here comes the hard part, stays to help. Or as Carol Levine's book also was entitled, it's someone who is always on call. That's what a family caregiver is. We've talked about the three-legged stool, and it's very important because we do use the word caregiver in many different forms. We have the care recipient, that's the person who is being cared for, sick physically, emotionally, spiritually, and as we know, if one area of our lives is distressed, it relates and it manifests in other parts. Secondly, there are the professional caregivers. These are the medical, the social workers, the clergy, the emotional workers, the mental health workers, all of whom are paid professional workers. They are the professional caregivers. And our topic is mostly unpaid family caregivers who are the backbone of the world's healthcare systems. And we say thank you, thank you, thank you. It's how I begin every talk, no matter where in the world I'm privileged to speak. And I'm delighted to say that we're getting many invitations now that I'm about to be able to fly again. I can't wait. Doing the exercises, walking a little bit better each day, but very grateful to my beloved Advantaged Care physicians. I'll be talking a little bit about them a little bit later. But last week, we had the opportunity to look at the first of the two words who define us. We talk about family caregivers. And last week we talked about family. And I was so pleased by some of you who sent in your homework as it was. I'd ask you to please take a look in your own lives, look at your family of origin, and look at your families of choice. Be aware, name them. Because when we name them, when we share them with our principal caregiver, our primary caregiver, that gives that caregiver names and people and resources to whom to go. So it's extremely important that we name them and we know who they may be. So if you haven't done that, please continue. Now, before I go into today's broadcast, I want to remind you of some of the other tools we have. On Facebook, and you would know that because you're watching me on Facebook Live, I'm Gregory Johnson. Please feel free to friend me and to follow me. I'm constantly putting up things that I find helpful in my life, and I am merely sharing them, as it were, in the good belief of the 12 steps. I'm neither endorsing nor opposing any cause. I'm simply sharing something that was valuable to me. If you find it valuable, read it, think about it, incorporate it, or delete and move onward. No one's insisting you do anything, but I find these things to be extremely helpful. So one way is to go on to Facebook, follow our regular programming. You know the schedule for it, and take a look at some of the other things, because often I post things that are really corollaries to the conversations that I'm having with you. Then, if you'd like to go back and look at past broadcasts, if you want to look at the original You Are Not Alone series that I did so long ago for Emblem Health, if you want to look at the Recovery in Recovering, where I'm talking about the 12 steps and how we use those in recovering during the pandemic time, but it goes on. Also, the Spiritual Toolkit. Many wonderful conversations and interviews that I've had the privilege of doing over the many years through Emblem Health and through other invitations. They're all on the YouTube channel. And the YouTube channel is very simply Family Caregiving with the Rev, R-E-V, Family Caregiving with the Rev. So please feel free to take a look at that. And then, of course, please, if you would like to be in touch with me, I'm anything but anonymous on that. My best email for you to use is Greg Johnson, all small case, Greg Johnson at gjp-international.com. Once again, Greg Johnson at gjp-international.com. And I'd love to speak with you and to hear your journey, to hear your questions, and to hear your suggestions of things that you'd like me to be sharing about, because that's what this is about. All over the world, we are united in family caregiving. That's what I find so exciting about it. And one of the things that I urge communities who are having difficulties of various natures, instead of dealing with the political, in the political correctness, why not let's go to the one thing we share in common, the love within us that allows us to be caregivers. Let's start there. Because when we start with that, what are we starting with? We're starting with love. And that's who we are, and that's who the spirit within us is. Whatever other names you may use, they're wonderful. They're fine. They're perfect. I'll choose love. Now, speaking of naming, this morning, I'm going to share with you, and this is a talk that I have done on many occasions. Now, of course, I'm never scripted. I only have some notes I like to be able to remember. And this segment amazes me. You know, as many of you know, 25 years ago, when I was invited by Dr. Carl Flemister, the then chairman of the Foundation for Emblem Health, to create the Care for the Family Caregiver program, I did not have a background in healthcare nor in caregiving. Mine was theater and theology. But because of one fact as a minister, and that was that, and it always just interested me. I never looked at it formally until this invitation came. And I said, Carl, you know, as he too a minister, I said, you know, the thing that amazes me is I have always been quite surprised that I have frankly buried, and now it's certain that I have buried more caregivers than care recipients. And I would like to be part of anything that could help keep caregivers and not create more care recipients. And to that, I have devoted my life and my ministry, and I am endlessly grateful to each of you because together we're able to do some of that, and that's what counts. But I've always been very practical in all of my business life. I'm not afraid to try something. To me, there's never failure. It might not have been the right path to have taken, but I learned something. It directed me to where I needed to be going, or it informed me that that wasn't the route, but this would be. So last week, I told you the story of how, talking of a family of choice, an apartment house, how we are a family of choice. Now, likewise, when I began this project, and I will tell you honestly that when Carl was speaking to me and saying, we want to talk and bring attention to the often silent patients, the family caregivers, I immediately went in my mind to my grandparents. I was blessed to know all of them, my mother's parents and my father's parents, and to be part of their caregiving teams. Not that I used that formal language at that time because I was just helping out, which is so often what we do. But over the years, I have come to appreciate, and because of invitations I've had, because of people who have come to me telling me their stories, I have expanded greatly. What do I mean by a care recipient? What do I mean by a family caregiver? A caregiver. We need to name it and know its many faces, because caregivers are not just doing the thing that I just talked about, and that's caring for seniors. Well, I'm now very much a senior and I'm being cared for. Thank you, Donnie. And a lot of other wonderful people. But it's not just seniors like me who are being cared for. There are also, and I'm one of them, a senior caring for other seniors. That gets us into this new sociological term of being old, which I am. But once you get past the 90 point, then you become the old. Well, I happen to be caring for two people in this building who are in the old category. I guess that's supposed to make me feel young. I'm just not sure. But it's seniors caring for seniors. Now, one of the first faces that I had never understood or really paid attention to, it's something that is so brilliantly done here in New York. And New York, I'm proud of New York, you know I am. But New York has been a leading advocate for something called kinship, which is grandparents raising grandchildren. Now, it doesn't always mean it's a grandparent relationship. It may be an aunt and an uncle, that sort of thing, but it's intergenerational, where someone who is older skip a generation and is caring for children. That is extremely powerful. Now, there's an organization, and why does that occur? Well, many times, and it's certainly a world that I'm involved with through the 12 steps, many times persons, middle age, younger even in fact, but our parents, who then become addicted or through addiction become involved in crime and become incarcerated, all of these possibilities where they are taken out of the family dynamic in person. And therefore, an older person suddenly is caring for a younger. Now, there's an organization here in New York, old organization, that has done service unbelievably. Today it's known as PSS, Presbyterian Senior Services. And it was based and is by the Presbyterian Church. But their outreach originally was the Bronx. That was way uptown when they began. Well, now we're all one big circle. We've widened the circle and filled in the spaces, so there's not too much empty land. But it began up there. And so they had a number of senior citizens. And a very dear friend of mine, now retired, David Taylor, was looking at a property they had, and there was a senior center that was doing wonderfully and very busy. And then there was a big piece of land. He thought, we need to build a housing unit there. And blessedly he did. It's the field of dreams, but it was a field of dream for an apartment house, a kinship home. PSS kinship or PSS grandparent home. You can Google it. And it has been absolutely incredible what has happened. They have become leaders in this field. People from all over the world come to see the work that is being done. And they built 1, 2, and 3 bedroom apartments. It's 8 or 9 stories high. And in it, they have all sorts of social service facilities and healthcare facilities. And it's been our privilege as Emblem Health to sponsor many events along with wonderful partners here in New York City. Well, this has always been special, and some of you have heard me share this story, but I particularly love it because it shows how we are united in family caregiving. I was invited to do a TED-like talk in Singapore for the International Federation, no, not International, International Longevity Center that is in Singapore. And I said, yes, be happy to do it. And they said, but afterward, can you stay and we'll do some questions? I said, sure, that's fine. Well, as we began the conversation afterward, and I was talking about what else, family caregiving, there was a lovely Indian lady. Now, Singapore is this wonderful multiracial city-state country. Wonderful lady, an Indian lady who raised her hand and she said, in point of fact, do you know a place called the Bronx? And I said, I certainly do. And I'll bet you're Presbyterian and you're going to ask me about Presbyterian Senior Services and their kinship program. And she said, right, on all accounts. I loved her. I loved her voice, and I say it lovingly. But she was wonderful, and we had a wonderful conversation. Now, I've told that story many times, but you see, good things move. And people who are looking and studying, that is the absolute excitement of it. So that was a very important program. And if you are dealing with that situation, Google it. Be in contact with Presbyterian Senior Services, PSS. Now, speaking of intergenerational, something we don't often think enough about, children as caregivers. There are many, many times that I have worked with groups of people who are putting together a caregiving team. And I always urge and invite them to please put in there some young people, some teenagers. What does it do? First of all, it teaches them family caregiving. None of us went to school to learn family caregiving. Well, this is a wonderful way to learn hands-on. But you know what I love about children and why I love to include them in almost anything that I'm doing? They're wonderful at this thing called technology. I'm not. They can Google things, they can find things, and they can be an enormous resource. And for them, it's just, oh, yes, yeah, well, here, that's what we need. They can help perhaps keep some records together. So there's a great deal that can be done, and it can be a learning experience as well as giving them the opportunity. And this is something I talked about recently in a broadcast I did in Indonesia. Becoming involved in caregiving, talking to caregivers, teaches people the healthcare system. It teaches them good healthcare for themselves. It teaches them good stewardship, but it also shares with them potential opportunities for careers. This area, that area, people, it's not just a doctor or a nurse. There are so many other pieces to healthy living. And becoming part of a team is a very wonderful way. So remember the children. Now, one of the things that is without question worldwide, it is long distance caregiving. A couple of years ago, well, it's more than that, I guess now, I had the privilege of attending the diaspora from Indonesia. Over 10,000 Indonesians came back to Jakarta for a huge conference, and the keynote speaker was President Obama. It was a wonderful, wonderful time, and I had the privilege of being part of a panel that talked about what life is like when you're away from home base, which is Indonesia. And I brought up the fact that unlike caregivers, now I live in New York, and my parents lived in Wisconsin. Well, 2.5 hour flight, and I can be there, do something to help, as I did, because my sister was the primary caregiver, but then hopped on a plane and I was back in New York. You can't do that with Indonesia. It's 28 hours or 24, 28 hours, depending how you go, to get there. Well, the weekend's gone by the time you get there and get back. So how do you deal with family caregiving? Because the work that you're doing in a foreign country is certainly blessing the finances of the family. So it's a very needed work, and you need to feel part of the situation, but be able to deal with the fact that you can't physically be there. Now, again, our technology helps us because there can be many, many calls, and there's a sense in which, just as we did with the pandemic, that we could be together even when we weren't together. But long distance caregivers have many special challenges beyond the fact of timing. Keep that in mind. Another face of family caregiving: chronic conditions. Now, these know no ages. Chronic conditions can be for children, middle of life, end of life, but they are there and they are there to stay. Another one that I like to talk about because it was very part of my experience when I first came out here to New York, and that's end of life in the middle of life. What am I talking about? It was the AIDS crisis, where there was not only prejudice, there was unknowing, and then this huge pandemic. And it wasn't what we thought of as being family caregiving. And yet that's where, as I told you last week, the word family of choice came from. So from out of everything come wonderful things. Then a number of years ago, I had the great privilege, a very dear friend of mine, the Reverend Thomas May, was the president of the National Bible Association. I used to chuckle because the abbreviation was NBA, and that's certainly the closest I ever got to NBA. But he was dealing with the National Bible Association, doing some wonderfully positive projects and made an enormous influence. It's a wonderful organization. And one of the topics we began talking about, because I began doing it also in one other area of my life, and that was talking about the veterans. And I'm not talking about veteran caregivers, I'm talking the military. And so we began exploring, Tom and I both, and contacts were made for me down in Washington. And I went down because I knew that we had resources, that if these chaplains could get this and get these resources for family caregiving, wherever they might be, because there are organizations all over America, particularly, I was focusing domestically on this project, that could be groups of caregiver coalitions begun by the National Alliance Caregiving. And I wanted to get them hooked up so that they might avail themselves of the resources, because many of them were totally unaware that they were available. Now, with the topic of the veteran, we also had knowledge of two areas that I've already talked about. And what do you think those two areas were? Well, one would be chronic conditions, because sadly, the wounds of today's wars are chronic conditions. They are going to be ongoing. And the spouses are going to be needed to care for the veteran, for the care recipient. And what does that lead to? That leads to kinship. Grandparents, aunts, and uncles, intergenerational help. So we had materials that could be of help. And I'm very grateful to say I was received beautifully and very lovingly by the chaplains in Washington, and we were able to make those connections, and I'm still grateful to know that they are going on. Now, another face of family caregiving. I told you of it last week, the story in Apartment House. It's a family of choice, but we care for one another. Don't forget that. Then, just Sunday night, I had the great privilege of joining the marvelous Sam Simon and the actor Chuck Obasi for another performance of The Actual Dance. Now, many of you have seen that because it's on my YouTube channel. You've also seen it in person because Sam has taken this. Now, we were celebrating the 10th anniversary, but what made this play unique was it was a story of a man, his caregiving journey. Now, that's not been well known, because we often think of caregiving as being something women do and women did as mothers and aunts and uncles and aunts. And then it was the gay families, the LGBT people. Oh, you're not married, you can do the caregiving. That often came next, and that's where men began. But slowly and quite extraordinarily, men are also standing up to the plate. What was marvelous about Sam, The Actual Dance, which is a beautiful, beautiful metaphor, a stellar play, And I have just learned that the rights to it are being dealt with in such a way that, like with any other play, people can access it for a fee, of course, and produce it in their local area. And it's wonderfully, wonderfully flexible. All families of choice, you will appreciate it. Um, but it was Sam's story as a man, his journey during his wife's breast cancer, the conflicts he had. How was he going to do it? And the metaphor of the actual dance, I'm not going to spoil it. It is too precious. There's a wonderful book out on it now. Sam has written the book with his wonderful wife, Susan. And what's wonderful about it, I'm just going to say this briefly so that those of you who might be interested in producing it in your area, it's a one act play. So those of you who are actors, give this a thought. But here is the original. Sam is Jewish. He's heterosexual. He's caring for his wife. He is a faithful Jewish gentleman. And in the middle of it, he sings the Mishaberach, which is the prayer for healing of body and soul. Him for the soul, Susan for her body. But as we went along with this play, and I had the pleasure of doing the talkback, so maybe 50, 60 times. We even did it off Broadway. That was great fun. But we realized that this play translates perfectly well because the story could be any relationship. Breast cancer is not just for women, even. But the very talented actor, and we all knew each other through Intersections International at that time, Chuck Obasi, African American, a Christian, heterosexual, took the play, and except for one or two things, instead of the Mishaberach, he sings How Great Thou Art. The prayer was there, and then, Oh Lord, hear my prayer. It was absolutely powerful. These are the things that teach. These are the things that open the door. This particular production has been done at many universities, Johns Hopkins, at Columbia University. Sam has done it in Israel, and there is a whole list of other places that they're doing it. So I urge you, am I passionate about this? Yes, because it's a creative way of dealing for Sam with his own emotional journey. But it opened the door because he was a wounded healer. His vulnerability allows each of us, and that's what you as caregivers do when you share your story. Now, a number of years ago, two more, a number of years ago, I was invited at the United Nations. They were doing a series on the homeless the world over. And so I was invited to speak about family caregiving. And so here we go again. In order to really prepare myself to speak, I didn't go to books. This is New York City. We have homeless people. And I, for many, many years, have known many of them. I've known many of them through my 30-some years in Alcoholics Anonymous. But I'd never really talked to them about family caregiving and hearing how they care for one another. So there are a couple of them who are extremely good friends of mine. I see them each week and have been pleased to be part of their lives. So I began to ask them questions, and I was blown away by the love and compassion, how each knows what's happening in the other life, how they're sharing resources, how they're sharing honestly very tragic and difficult circumstances. But it was very important to share that it's not just throwing services up, but inviting them to the table to be part of the conversation. Because remember, we don't help anybody in this world unless we meet them right where they are with no judgment, just unconditional love. And saying, this has been my expertise and background. You're living it in a very different way that I don't know and understand. Let's talk. Maybe I can help you, but I know you're going to help me to better understand how I can be helpful. So I gave the speech, and I'm happy to say it was extremely well received. And not only just received and then put on a shelf, but various actions were taken from it. And for that, I'm very grateful. Now, the last one I want to share was one that I was blessed to learn by. Dr. Tina Mosky from the Fordham University, the law school. Brilliant social work into the criminology, into so many things that I know nothing about. Invited me to be part of a panel, and she wanted me to talk about family caregiving. And I said, well, I've not been in prison other than to go and do AA meetings. I've really never been in prisons here or in other parts of the world. She said, Greg, you'll be very interested to know. She said, I want you to watch a movie. And I'd like you to watch it. You can Google it. It's called the Angola Project. Now, the Angola Project, the Angola prison, is in the South here in America. It's a prison for some of the most heinous crimes that have been committed, for persons who have committed those crimes. They are life sentences, and they're going to be there for life. Well, what does that mean? They're aging in place. And what is the place? It's a prison. Who cares for the caregiver? Who cares for the care recipient? Well, it's the prisoners. This story that we see in the Angola Project, I just weep every time I see it, because it's the greatest story of redemption I have ever seen. A murderer caring for a murderer, walking them home, as Ram Dass says, being present with them as they die. And then having said, I'm so grateful. I get choked up when I say this. I'm so grateful to have been able to do this. I always wanted to be in the medical field, but drugs, alcohol, life got in the way. I am grateful that I am now able to be part of a world that helps people. Don't give up on anybody, no matter what the circumstance is. Don't give up. And I urge you to look at that film. And then one final group, it's called the world. Why do I say that? Ladies and gentlemen, you know as well as I do, we've all come out of the panic. It's the pandemic. Now, we know it's still going on, but during the worldwide lockdown, we became caregivers. Caregivers in ways we never, ever expected. As an ordained clergyman, did I ever, ever dream that I would do memorial services and funerals online, sitting here in my bedroom? I did. And it was meaningful, and I'm very grateful to have done that. We learned, we accommodated, we explored, we experienced, we tried, because we care. So I hope today's conversation, it's a topic I love, because my mind has been blessed and exploded with the many faces of family caregiving. And many individuals, many of you, are dealing with people who are in these various categories. One is not more important or more worthy than another. And so we say thank you. But it is important to name these, because in naming them, we can remember the burden and the stress that we're going through, And we need to remember rule number one and the only rule in family caregiving. Before I can care for you, I've got to care for myself, because it's been our mission at Emblem Health, and it remains our mission here to keep caregivers caregivers, not to create more care recipients. Now, I look forward to seeing you next week. We're going to go into a 3-week period where we talk about caregiving physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Each of them has overlapping considerations, but some that are things that are very specific to each. And I think reminding us of these just might help us open the door. And it's at that point I'm going to talk to you more about Advantage Care physicians and what you need to be doing when you go to the doctor. So join me next Friday. But now this week, think about the many faces of caregiving that you know and are involved in. And let us always remember, onward in love and caregiving. Namaste. God bless, and I look forward so much to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.